Without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Kristin Voigt from Philosophy at McGill, who will introduce our first keynote speaker, Gaile Pohlhaus.
Fantastic, thank you, Amandine. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the day and the first keynote speaker of this conference, Gaile Pohlhaus from Miami University, who will be talking about epistemic pressure and intersectional interdependence. And before you start, I will pass this around the mic. And maybe we'll leave it right here. Is that good for you?
I think I'm going to go like this because I believe this is showing the people online me. I'm not sure. Okay. So thank you so much, Amandine and Belly for inviting me, and to the amazing support team that is helping everything run so smoothly, from technology to food to setup, etc. So the title for my talk today is admittedly vague. There are a number of things that I want to think through with you today, and I couldn't come up with a snappy title to kind of hold them all together. So when Amandine asked, I gave her two of the ideas I knew I'd be working with and said, call it this, right? If I had to give it a different title at this point, I might call it Gathering Reminders for Surviving and Resisting in a World Structured by Epistemic Oppression. But I'm not sure about that either. So I'm going to begin by telling you some of the aims I have in the talk, and hopefully that will be enough of a frame to help me make sense to you so that we can make further sense together during the Q&A. So this talk has a few aims. One of them is to work through the following sentence from Audre Lorde. Survival is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. I've had the phrase learning to take our differences and make them strengths on my mind for over 30 years now, stated myself. Sometimes at the forefront, sometimes in the back, but always trying to think through the details of what Lorde's words mean. So part of what I want to do today is a close reading of these words and the words that surround them in the essay in which Lorde wrote them, spelling out what I think are some important epistemic consequences embedded within these words. I also want to share with you an example that I think shows something important that in part motivates and frames this particular iteration of my wanting to understand Lorde's words. And finally, I want to share with you some language that helps me to think through things I find important in both Lorde's quote and the example, because the language of Euro-American epistemology does not help me to think through what I take to be important in both. And I don't think that's an accident, although that's a whole other talk. We can talk about it in the Q&A too. So the plan for today, let's see, is to begin with the example, which will introduce a shift in perspectives on what we attend to and how in a world structured in part through epistemic oppression. Then to think through the Lorde quote from the space opened up by the example. While thinking through the Lorde quote, I will introduce the language of epistemic pressure and intersectional interdependence, which I hope will vibe with and help to keep open the spaces afforded by what I want us to notice through the example, and one way of understanding the Lorde quote. And to be clear here, intersectional interdependence, I take to be implicit in what Lorde means by interdependence. So that phrase itself is not some new thing, just me making what is implicit explicit, so that we can think carefully about what Lorde means by interdependence. Then I will return to the example to think through it further in light of Lorde's words and the ideas of epistemic pressure and intersectional interdependence. So the example. The example comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who in her words is, quote, a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And it comes from her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. In it, she describes meeting her advisor during her first year of college with the following. So this is a long quote from Kimmerer. Quote, "There were hardly any women at the forestry school in those days, and certainly none who looked like me. The advisor peered at me over his glasses and said, 'So why do you want to major in botany?' His pencil was poised over the registrar's form. How could I answer? How could I tell him that I was born a botanist, that I had shoeboxes of seeds and piles of pressed leaves under my bed, that I'd stop my bike along the road to identify a new species, that plants colored my dreams, that the plants had chosen me?" So I told him the truth. I was proud of my well-planned answer, its freshman sophistication apparent to anyone, the way it showed that I had already knew some plants and their habitats, that I had thought deeply about their nature, and was clearly well prepared for college work. I told him that I chose botany because I wanted to learn about why asters and goldenrod look so beautiful together. And as you can see, they do. Right? I'm sure I was smiling then in my red plaid shirt, but he was not. He laid down his pencil as if there was no need to record what I had said. "Miss Wall," he said, fixing me with a disappointed smile, "I must tell you that that is not science. That is not at all the sort of thing with which botanists concern themselves." End quote. Under the standard terminology of epistemic injustice literature, we might say that the advisor is viewing his student as less competent because of who she is. Note that the problem here isn't one where the advisor fails to believe his student's testimony, for surely he does not fail to believe that she wants to learn about asters and goldenrod. Rather, the wrong concerns failing to interact with the student as someone who has something of epistemic worth to bring to the situation. That the advisor harbors wrongful prejudices about his student's competence is certainly suggested, not only in the manner with which he interacts with her in this moment, but also by the fact that he later wrote in his recommendation letter for her applications to graduate school that, quote, "She's done remarkably well for an Indian girl," end quote. In addition to the advisor's attitude, however, there is a serious lack of understanding going on here, which puts us in the hermeneutical realm. But to call the wrong a hermeneutical injustice would be to say that the language and tools available for expressing what the student wants to express are not available, so that she is having trouble knowing exactly why she wants to study botany. But this is clearly wrong. Kimmerer did know. It was the advisor who had trouble understanding how the kind of motivation she was expressing fit within his understanding of botany as a science. The wrong here seems to be closer to what I have called willful hermeneutical ignorance, where a marginally situated knower does have resources to understand her own experience, but a dominantly situated knower is not competent in those resources, and furthermore, does not take those resources seriously so that they can continue ignoring what the resources are designed to show. So already the standard language of testimonial exchange and hermeneutical gaps does not seem to fit well with this particular example. However, I want to recommend that we approach the example from an entirely different perspective. For even if we tweak the definitions available in the epistemic injustice literature, I think the perspective with which these concepts move is still limited to identifying what the advisor is doing wrong and helping the advisor know how to do things better, but not from the position of the student, helping her to navigate this situation. What I want to say is that the language of epistemic injustice is fitted to or works with the advisor's subjectivity, whereas the student's subjectivity is posited only as an afterthought, if even at all. Pointing out testimonial or participant injustice tells the advisor he ought to take his student more seriously, and pointing out a kind of hermeneutical injustice, tells the advisor he might be lacking the tools to fully understand and appreciate what his student is saying. While both of these observations might assure the student that she is in fact being wronged and might be used to dissuade her advisor from treating her this way, neither really suggests what she might do apart from making her advisor a better person. In other words, I'm interested in the possibilities for resistance that move away from, not toward, the source of harm, or at the very least, that would protect her from the harm in this interaction. Of course, Kimmerer herself is already showing us something about how to do that, insofar as she is providing resources for her former self as she recounts this memory, noting that her response was well-planned, with a freshman's sophistication apparent to anyone, affirming that her answer demonstrated that she already knew some plants and their habitats, that she had thought deeply about their nature, and was in fact clearly prepared for college work. I think Kimmerer's description of her relation to the plants also matters here, that they colored her dreams and that the plants had chosen her. I've arranged Kimmerer's words around the image of asters and goldenrod here, because I like to think that what Kimmerer is doing in this passage is building an epistemic shelter in the face of a hostile environment, a shelter that provides nourishing sense not only to herself as a knower, but to her relationship with the world she knows, and with these plants in particular. I want to suggest that the language used in Euro-American epistemology is not particularly apt either for describing the harm in this interaction or for recognizing the epistemic work Kimmerer is doing in this example. For an important way of understanding the harm here is not just as a harm to Kimmerer as a knower, but rather a harm to the knowing relationship Kimmerer is cultivating between herself and the plants she has grown up with. She's gone to college to cultivate that relationship, and her advisor has contributed to a hostile environment that potentially thwarts the knowing relationship between Kimmerer and the plants she loves. Indeed, as Shelby Meisner has argued, quote, settler colonialism, among many other atrocities, continues to deprive Indigenous communities of caretaking their relatives and of being cared for by their relatives, end quote, where kin importantly includes members of the more than human environment, such as plants. Nonetheless, in reflecting back on this encounter, Kimmerer builds shelter within which that relationship can thrive, despite the ongoing hostile social environments structured by settler colonialism. Because the standard picture of knowledge in Euro-American epistemology misses a great deal of the harm happening in this example and fails to adequately appreciate both the labor needed to protect against that harm and the knowledge work Kimmerer engages as she extends this example to her reader, I recommend a shift in pictures. From knowledge as a static object to be extracted from the world and traded among knowers, where value is certified through justification and credibility, to knowledge work as something that helps subjects remain attuned to and with the world over time. And I'm just gonna call attention here, hopefully, there we go, to like the kind of parallel, here, let me see if I can do this, yeah. Knowledge versus knowledge work, object versus subject, traded versus attuned with, to and with, and this kind of certification of value that kind of fixes the value versus work that transpires over time, right? And as I was thinking through these kind of parallels, one of the things, at least this time, I was struck by was how much time doesn't seem to figure in analytic epistemology. Somebody can like correct me on that if I'm wrong, but it seems like the only place time comes up is with respect to fallibilism. Like we will be open to the future, like future evidence. But my experience of knowing an epistemic activity has a lot to do with time. So it's very curious and interesting that that is absent from the standard picture. So the particular knowledge work with which I'm interested today, or that I'm interested in thinking about today with respect to Kimmerer's encounter and thinking through Audre Lorde's quote, is the work of coordinating actively and interdependently with other subjects to maintain shelter or space within which to notice, attend to, and make sense of the word over time, given a social environment that is hostile to what Lugones and other Latina feminists call multiplicity or multiple subjectivities. I'm going to return now to Audre Lorde's counsel that survival is learning to take our differences and make them strengths. What I'm wondering here is how an understanding of knowing as a set of activities that helps subjects to build relations with the world over time, and where knowers must work to protect those relationships from hostile environments, can strengthen an understanding of the imperative to value differences, not as something to be overcome, but strengths. Said differently, while the context of Kimmerer's encounter and the context of Lorde's essay are distinct, both suggest a picture of knowing that values relationality. And I think both can help knowers when our capacities to build and nurture relations, knowing relations, are compromised by structures of oppression. Lorde makes this statement within the essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." So the context here is one in which Lorde is addressing a group of white women academics engaging in knowledge work where poor women, women of color, and lesbians are absent. And Lorde has been called in at the last hour to represent difference on a single panel, as if differences among women would have no bearing on any of the other panels. As such, Lorde warns that the work being done is not liberatory, but work that simply enables some to possibly get ahead within oppressive systems. In other words, the lack of diversity in social positioning among women at the conference reflects a disregard for the various ways in which oppressive relations structure women's lives, and thus a lack of care for truly dismantling systems that are oppressive to women. I think many of us are familiar with this aspect of the essay, even if some of us, self-included, need to continually relearn it. Today, I'm interested in following Lorde through the strand of thought that positively recommends valuing differences. Lorde was noting that the preconditions for truly liberatory knowledge work that adequately responds from and to the lives of women were missing. Note that the phrase here is to make differences into strengths. So Lorde is calling attention to an activity and not simply the presence of difference. I'm interested in detailing further the sense in which differences can be strengths and the epistemic work that differences can do to both nurture better relations with the world and act as an epistemic shelter for protecting those knowing relations in the face of epistemic oppression. So the word difference appears 22 times in Lorde's The Master's Tools. 8 times difference is used to refer to differences in social position, as well as different experiences of oppression that arise from those differences in social position. Twice, Lord specifies that she is considering non-dominant differences or different ways of being excluded, such that the kind of work she is recommending is among differently situated oppressed persons, not between oppressed and oppressor. And those for whom survival is learning to make differences strengths are specifically, quote, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, end quote, who learn, quote, how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish, end quote. The remaining instances in the essay of the use of the word difference primarily characterize difference as sources of community, powerful connection, creativity, and strength. So the noticing of differences here is a noticing that recognize and working with differences is one that works, is a noticing that recognizes that there are a multitude of ways that structure oppression, that there is something to be learned about dismantling and resisting oppression by attending to the ways in which those structures operate on others who are not privileged by them. Here, Lord is recommending what I have called, following Maria Lugones, horizontal as opposed to vertical attention. That is, attention that connects with others differently situated in relation to dominance, but not those who are primarily positioned in places of privilege. Here I want to introduce the language of epistemic pressure to consider what it means for those who are differently situated outside of structures of acceptability to make common cause in trying to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. So epistemic pressure, the way I'm understanding it here, is the way the world presses upon subjects, calling those subjects to respond to the world in some way. Knowers are situated within a world that presses upon us. So this is a different way of thinking what knowing is than justified true belief. Knowers are situated within a world that presses upon us materially and to which we are all, in the end, vulnerable. Material, even if we're more vulnerable, some are more vulnerable than others, given the way we have structured our social relations. Material pressures call our attention to particular aspects of the world to which we respond by attempting to make sense of those pressures in ways that allow us to do things in and with the world, like navigate, anticipate, avoid, or alter different parts of the world that press upon us. In other words, the world presses on knowers and knowers respond. When knowers respond successfully in ways that coordinate well with the world and other knowers, I would call this knowing, or building knowing relations, being attentive to and with the world. For example, the sun has set and my partner told me she would likely be home by early evening. My knowing that she will be home soon is a result of the way the world presses upon me, the light outside, her words this morning in my memory, that I care about when she returns, combined with norms about what it means to say, I will likely be home by early evening. Under the standard model, we would call these justifications, but I want to call them pressures to which I respond, such that my knowing is embodied in the way I am oriented in the world. By half listening for her footsteps, walking to the door, or if I were more immersed in an activity like making dinner, my knowing might be embodied in the way I am not surprised at all when she walks through the front door, or the fact that I laugh when I am surprised when she opens the door, because of course I knew she was coming home soon. As knowers, we are fallible in how we attend to the world, since the way the world presses upon us is complex, and not all of the world presses upon any given knower in every possible way. We are finitely located within it. Fortunately for the vulnerable finite creatures that knowers are, we can also coordinate with one another with respect to the world, And this expands our capacity to make sense of and cognitively coordinate with the world. In other words, knowers can not only coordinate with the world, but also with each other. We utilize interdependently held capacities of embodied mind in coordinated ways to navigate the world, thereby expanding what it is about the world we are able to notice and anticipate. We do this via epistemic norms, concepts, frameworks. These ways of coordinating give rise to new pressures, or at least potential new pressures, through which other knowers can call our attention to different aspects of the world. So I'm divvying up the kinds of epistemic pressures to which knowers respond and with which we coordinate our attention into two. One, worldly material pressures, or the way the world presses on me such that I may be moved to try to know something about it. This would be knowledge from the senses, but also things from the social world that impact me directly, like I have bills to pay, that presses on me and takes my attention away from some things towards others. And I think these pressures form what feminist epistemologists have called lived experience, these material pressures over time. And secondly, collectively held pressures, norms, practices, collectively held epistemic environments that press on me to pay attention to or regard the world in particular ways, but that also help to correct and direct attention. This second group of pressures are ways of coordinating embodied minds so that an individual's capacities are extended beyond their finite, fallible individual being. And I think just a simple example that this fits with the phenomenon whereby subjects notice instances of concepts more readily when they've learned the concept, right? You learn something and then all of a sudden you see it everywhere. The world now suddenly presses on you differently because you've received a collectively held resource. It allows the world to press upon me more readily than it did before. It also provides an avenue for talking about the way in which lived experiences can impact perceptions and understandings of the world for knowers who stand in different social positions without eliding epistemic differences in relation to the world. So we might say that the world of actual microaggressions happens to certain people and not others. And then a language is developed to talk about that. And that language enters the collectively held norms. So now people who don't experience microaggressions can very well know what microaggressions are, even if they don't experience them, but they don't know them via experiencing them. They don't know them because that's how the world presses on them. They know them because that's how the world presses on other people who have informed them. So it gets us out of this kind of like, you have to be in it to know it, or if you know it, suddenly now you are experiencing it. No. Neither of those, both you're not experiencing it and you can know it. Sorry, I just had to, that point. To build knowing relations with the world requires building interdependent relations with others. I want to suggest that if we think of knowledge work as something that helps subjects remain attuned to and with the world over time, and we acknowledge that each knower is finitely placed within the world, such that we only have a finite number of ways to be sensitive to and responsive to the world around us, each knower's connection to another is critical for a fuller and richer sense of the world. Certainly, knowers who are differently harmed by a system of oppressive structures working together from their different places in relation to that system will be able to understand it better. But more generally speaking, knowers rely on other knowers to attend to a wider sense of the world. And of course, under conditions of oppression, this second set of pressures are ways of exploiting the cognitive capacities of one group or set of groups in order to serve the interests of another. Oppressive, coerced, interdependent relations subordinate others to solidify some amount of control over our environment, whereas reciprocal interdependent relations that are mutually supportive bring responsiveness to the broader world we inhabit together. This is how I understand Lorde when she writes, quote, interdependency between women is the way to a freedom which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. Let me see. Yeah. Right, interdependency allows the I to be not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. Knowing subjects must rely upon one another, and in a world structured by material exploitation, this leads to epistemic exploitation. Thus, as standpoint theory has argued, the material conditions of the world, how we as social beings have structured and are structured within it, impacts the possibilities for interdependence. Not because it's impossible to be mutually interdependent in ways that allow all to flourish, but because it is hard to dismantle and resist systems of oppression where people do not flourish. This is the difference between what Femi Taiwo has called elite capture, where resources are extracted from groups to serve the elite, a weaponization of identity politics that replicates the master's tools, and what Lorde means by true, what I'm tagging as intersectional interdependence, explicitly working to build mutually supportive relations. To begin to do so requires changing material relations and working within what Lorde calls an interdependency of different strengths acknowledged and equal. Notice that Lorde talks here of different strengths as opposed to differences as strength. And by different strengths, I take her to mean those strengths that are forged through different experiences of oppression and the different subjectivities developed in resistance to oppression. Chief among the strengths needed to forge intersectional networks of interdependence are those strengths developed through navigating multiple oppressions. Those who are situated in the world facing multiple oppressions, for example, as women who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, engage the work of relating with and moving across multiple non-dominant communities on a regular basis. But in order for this kind of strength to be acknowledged and equal interdependence, it must not slip into the tendency to use, as Lorde warns, asking those who are multiply oppressed within groups to, quote, stretch across the gap of ignorance, to educate as to our existence, our differences, our relative roles in our joint survival. For this, Lorde writes, is a diversion of energies and a tragic repetition of racist patriarchal thought, end quote. Instead, intersectional interdependence identifies, acknowledges, and enables the relations of those positioned within multiple non-dominant communities in ways that are creative and sustain worlds of sense within which multiple subjectivities can flourish. Returning to the opening example, one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the work I've shared with you today is to practice a kind of thinking with, as opposed to thinking about, other knowers in a manner that parallels what Linda Martine Elkoff and Gayatri Spivak suggest when they write about speaking to and with rather than for others. Thinking with Kimmerer's writing, as opposed to simply about, or worse, for her, requires a kind of attention to her active subjectivity, to notice not only what she says with her words, but what she does with her writing. It also requires an openness to allowing the world, through her words, to press on the reader, not in order to deny or displace the differences between where reader and writer stand in relation to the world, but to bring readers into greater responsiveness to and with the world. Models of knowing that focus on knowing objects and propositions, ask what can be extracted from another, which is exactly the wrong question here. Instead, to think with requires building and sustaining knowing relations in ways that can creatively transform subjects, allowing the I to be an active being. Thank you.